Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to our interns debate. The subject tonight, as you probably know, they're going to debate the proposition that it's in Australia's best interest to prioritise offensive cyber measures over defensive measures in the current threat environment. This subject's been chosen against the background of global cyber attacks increasing in frequency and severity, which is a serious problem to all nations, and Australia as an advanced technological and industrial society prominent among them. In fact, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has listed cyberspace and critical technology as foreign policy priorities in the lead up to 2030. So tonight our interns are going to raise and discuss the issue of what we should be doing and how aggressively we should be doing it. On the affirmative team, our first speaker, I haven't brought my list, our first speaker is Singiti. Singiti Herat is a fourth-year student at the University of Sydney, completing a Bachelor of Arts and Advanced Studies focused on international and global studies. So over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin today by telling you a story about my friend Sarah, who, like many Australians, had her life turned upside down in 2022. It all started with a phone call, not the kind of call anybody wants to receive. Her bank informed her that multiple credit cards had been opened up in her name and her entire savings account had been wiped. How did this happen? Sarah's personal information, her credit card details, passport details, driver's license, home address, had been leaked in the Optus data breach. The deposit for a new house Sarah had been saving for, the payments towards her car, the money she set aside for health expenses, her financial security, all gone. In an instant, Sarah, alongside millions of other Australians, found herself in a vulnerable position, with cybercriminals holding her most sensitive information. Over the following months, she fought desperately to regain control of her identity. The financial burden was immense, but the emotional toll even worse. Every day, she would check her accounts, constantly worrying about who had access to her information and what they might do with it. Her sense of security and everything she had worked so hard for was stolen in an instant. And yet, Sarah's story is far from unique. It's a growing fear for millions of Australians. Is our personal information and data truly safe? By prioritising an offensive cyber approach, breaches such as this one could have been prevented. How? This approach aims to deter, disrupt, and degrade the capacity of adversaries, whether they are state actors or criminal organisations that pose a threat to Australia's national security. The alternative, defensive measures, focuses only on safeguarding systems through firewalls, antivirus systems, and other protections that primarily respond to attacks after they occur. But Sarah's story shows us why this reactive stance is no longer enough to keep Australia's cyberspace secure. This is why today, as the affirmative team, we argue that Australia must prioritise offensive cyber measures over defensive ones in the current threat environment. Offensive measures go beyond merely reacting to cyber attacks. They focus on proactively identifying and neutralising threats before they can cause damage. Now let me outline the key points my team will present in favour of prioritising offensive cyber measures. First, I'll explain how offensive cyber strategies can strengthen our defensive capabilities by providing us with critical insights into the tactics used by adversaries. Next, Matt will argue that offensive measures are crucial for neutralising threats before they can hurt Australia's national security. And finally, Newman will demonstrate that in order to maintain leadership in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia must adopt an offensive cybersecurity strategy that adheres to legal and ethical guidelines. Now let's look at the facts. According to the 2024 Lowy Institute poll, Australians now view cyber attacks as the greatest threat to Australia's vital interests over the next 10 years. Since 2017, concern over cyber threats have only grown, with more Australians recognising the dangers of a digital landscape increasingly under siege, with their personal safeties now being the ones that are compromised. We've already witnessed the devastation caused by cyber attacks, such as the 2022 Optus breach, but in just the past 5 years, cyber criminals have struck organisations such as Canva, Medibank, Eastern Health, the Australian Parliament House, Tasmanian Ambulance, and Service New South Wales. These attacks just haven't targeted businesses, they've impacted everyday Australians, leaving them vulnerable and putting our critical infrastructure at risk. The services that are essential for everyday life: transport, communication, healthcare, and banking. One well-coordinated attack against our critical infrastructure could put this whole country to a standstill. But it doesn't just stop at stealing data. Threats in cyberspace come in many forms, including misinformation campaigns launched by state actors intent on sowing division and undermining trust in our democratic institutions. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute has extensively studied how these disinformation campaigns destabilise national security. China, for instance, is expanding its digital infrastructure to conduct online covert influence operations to manipulate global public opinion on social media by hiring transnational criminal organisations to disproportionately amplify voices of dissent. Cyber-enabled foreign interference is a direct threat to Australians that can create distrust, division, and doubt. In this increasingly volatile and interconnected world, cyber threats are evolving at a rapid pace. Criminals are becoming more opportunistic, striking at even the slightest weakness. Waiting to respond defensively puts Australia in a vulnerable position, leaving us exposed to attacks that could be catastrophic, not just for individuals like Sarah, but for the nation as a whole. Although defensive measures are important, they are insufficient on their own. With the current threat environment becoming harder to predict, an offensive approach will help maintain Australia's national security. Offensive cyber measures do not do more than just respond to attacks. They help us understand and anticipate them. By actively seeking out and studying potential vulnerabilities, we gain a deeper understanding of the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by attackers. This proactive approach allows us to train our systems and personnel better to counteract these threats before they reach our shores. Offensive actions such as red teaming or penetration testing simulate attacks on our own system, exposing weaknesses that would otherwise go unnoticed. The insights gained from these simulations can then be applied to enhance our defenses, making them more adaptive and resilient. When we know what our adversaries are planning, we're far better equipped to stop them. Another key element of offensive cyber strategies is gathering intelligence on threats before they reach us. This involves identifying cyber attacks in their early stages and infiltrating adversarial networks to understand their capabilities and plans. By doing so, we can train our systems to better understand the attacks that may come our way. Infiltrating and monitoring these networks provides us with the intelligence needed to suppress attacks at their roots, ensuring we're not just waiting for the next attack, but actively preventing it. By prioritizing offensive measures, we gain the ability to protect our system and our people from the threat of cyber attacks. It's not enough to build walls around our defenses. We must also seek out and dismantle the threats before they can strike. In doing so, we create a more comprehensive, robust security framework that ensures the safety of our nation as a whole. In today's world, where the cost of cyber attacks is measured not just in dollars, but in trust, security, peace of mind, and lives, we can no longer afford to be reactive. Only by prioritizing an offensive cyber strategy can we truly safeguard our future. Thank you.
The first speaker for the negative team is Jacob Sukyanik, who's a recent graduate of the University of New South Wales, where he studied a double Bachelor of International Studies and Media, including Communication and Journalism.
Good evening, adjudicator, members of the affirmative team, and members of the audience. My name is Jacob Sukyanik, and I'm the first speaker for the negative team. We wholeheartedly disagree with the affirmative team and believe that it is not in Australia's best interest to prioritise offensive measures over defensive cyber measures in the current threat environment. In order to prove that Australia's best interests are served by prioritising defensive cyber measures, I'll first argue that offensive measures are inherently escalatory and belligerent. I will then offer a number of defensive measures, which, when prioritised over offensive measures, clearly play into Australia's best interests. I'll conclude by outlining the importance of cyber diplomacy as both a defensive measure we should prioritise and a means of promoting normative and collaborative international structures that serve Australia's security agenda and serve our interests. Following this, our second speaker, Paloma, will elaborate on the harms of an offensive-led approach, utilising case studies and examples such as the attribution dilemma and the security dilemma as to why Australia should prioritise defensive cybersecurity strategies. Finally, our third speaker, Ethan, will further build on these arguments in order to conclude that in our current threat environment, the prioritisation of offensive measures will lead only to more insecurity, thereby proving that the prioritisation of defensive cybersecurity strategies will best serve Australia's security interests. Before I begin, I must first challenge the definitions that the affirmative team have suggested. We fundamentally disagree with these definitions. As a negative team, we define offensive cyber measures as belligerent, aggressive, and antagonistic measures, otherwise unretaliatory practices, designed specifically to cause harm by targeting the cyber infrastructure of an adversarial state or non-state actor. Prioritising offensive measures is not proactive, but provocative, and, as my teammates and I will argue, serves to destabilise the status quo of the international community and ultimately make Australia less secure. While the affirmative team claims that offensive cyber measures are preventative and proactive, we believe that defensive cybersecurity measures can take a myriad of forms and include investments in network cyber resilience and cyber hygiene, the promotion of collaborative, communicative, and multilateral efforts through cyber diplomacy, and a focus on active detection, response, and repair measures. We, as the negative team, argue that defensive measures of cybersecurity are not merely passive or reflexive. They're an active pursuit that seek to protect Australian infrastructure, interests, and way of life. Importantly, we believe that offensive measures are not mutually exclusive to defensive measures. We do not oppose offensive strategies in their entirety, but defensive measures must be prioritised given our current threat environment. We do agree that Australia finds itself in a precarious environment. There are rising tensions at our doorstep and in the greater region that require careful and considerate action. Although the security environment we find ourselves in is increasingly escalatory, importantly, we still operate within a rules-based order. We will argue that entering into the lawless realm of offensive cyberspace is not only not in our best security interests, but it subverts the very normative, rules-based international order that Australia respects and relies on. As the affirmative team have mentioned, the very real threat of cyber warfare is something that weighs on the minds of Australians. 97% of Australians believe that cybersecurity threats are an important or critical threat to Australia more than any other threat, more than any other issue. As we enter into this new frontier, it's crucial that we prioritise careful and considerate action. Exclusively offensive cybersecurity measures are exactly the opposite of that. They're belligerent, antagonistic, and they make us less secure. Offensive measures are not proactive but provocative. They aggravate our adversaries and significantly increase the likelihood of conflict through retaliatory action. Offensive measures are hostile measures and destabilise the international system by creating a cycle of escalatory cyber warfare. While they may offer some short-term benefits to Australia, in the long term, offensive measures enacted in our current threat environment, and exclusively enacted, have the capacity of creating a tit-for-tat exchange, something that threatens our interests and poses an enormous risk of subverting Australia's security agenda. The destabilising nature of offensive cyber measures is made clear through an understanding of basic international relations theory. The security dilemma, outlined by realist theorist Kenneth Waltz, describes a process where one state is forced to retaliate to offensive measures with offensive measures of their own. As our second speaker, Paloma, will argue, this dilemma makes Australia vulnerable in the long term. Instead, defensive measures are crucial in maintaining Australia's interests and should be prioritised over offensive strategies in our currently volatile threat environment. Prioritising defensive strategies means prioritising strategies like anticipatory threat detection, active response and repair measures, and building proactive defence infrastructure. By promoting defensive measures over offensive measures, we promote cyber resilience. This is an investment that pays dividends in the context of our tenuous threat environment. Fostering cyber resilience and strength is an active, anticipatory strategy that is more effective in delivering a long-term response to cyber insecurity. Unlike belligerent offensive measures that prioritise the possibility of some short-term benefits at the expense of long-term security, defensive measures are an active prophylactic. They ensure the security of our national interests in the long term without the unnecessary provocation brought about by aggressive offensive measures. Another crucial measure that should be favoured over belligerence and offensive strategy is cyber diplomacy. Not only is cyber diplomacy a strong defensive measure that we should prioritise given our current threat environment, but also offers a means of promoting the normative international structures that we rely on for our continued security. Pursuing an antagonistic, offensive strategy undermines the very norms that Australia governs itself by as a liberal democracy. Moreover, this strategy further subverts the norms that we respect and rely upon in the arena of international affairs. Australia is a key player in international relations, and as my teammates will argue, has a responsibility to uphold the values and normative structures we respect. Offensive cyberspace is lawless, and belligerent acts of cybersecurity subvert the norms we rely on as a middle-power democracy. By prioritising the building of cyber norms through cyber diplomacy, not only do we lead by example, but we bolster our own security in the long term. As established, while offensive measures may provide a chance of short-term benefit, they fail to adequately protect our interests beyond that. Cyber diplomacy builds trust amongst our allies, fosters strategic multilateral relationships, and forms normative structures that ensure our own cybersecurity. In conclusion, it's clear that prioritising offensive measures would not play into Australia's best interests. The escalatory, belligerent nature of adopting an offensive-led cybersecurity approach undermines our national interests and security agenda. These offensive measures are not proactive, but provocative, and chasing them will hurt us more in the long run. Luckily, we have an alternative. Building a robust, active defensive network is an investment in protecting Australian interests that will pay dividends for generations. Paired with a focus on cyber diplomacy, which allows us to both build trust amongst our allies, as well as a normative framework to address cyber defence, prioritising defensive measures ensures that Australians stay safe and our interests stay protected within our volatile threat environment. Thank you.
The second speaker for the affirmative case is Matthew McKelvey, the Dale Scholar at the University of Sydney, where he's doing a double major in political economy and international business.
Thank you, Singathy, for the introduction to our affirmative position, and thank you too to Jacob, who provided insight into why Australia's resources may be put to good use in the defensive arena. And let me start by saying that we agree. We agree that to protect the interests of Australia's people, to maintain our democracy, and to safeguard our critical infrastructure, resources must be allocated towards strengthening the defensive capabilities of our businesses and citizens. This is precisely why the Australian government has spent $290 million in the 2030 cybersecurity strategy. They've used this to build the protective capacity of businesses. They've used this to increase public awareness and fight cybercrime. However, the affirmative team strongly disagrees with the opponent's suggestion that prioritising defensive measures can protect Australia in an increasingly hostile cyber environment over offensive strategies. While defence is undoubtedly crucial, it is inherently reactive. It prepares us for those threats we know, but it does little to protect us against the threats that we do not know. To truly safeguard our national interests, we must adopt a proactive stance, one that prioritises robust offensive capabilities to disrupt and deter adversaries before they can strike. This proactive response, in tandem with our existing defensive strategies, ensures a comprehensive security posture that is both adaptive, anticipatory, and ultimately more effective in countering the sophisticated and evolving threats in cyberspace. Now, like many of you in the audience who have done your research for today, I imagine, I found it significantly harder to find examples of offensive cyber operations carried out by Australia and our allies. The reasons for this are unclear, but my interest was piqued. I even went as far as to creating an account on Baidu, China's version of Google, sifting through articles with my broken Mandarin, hoping to find a case where an adversary had attributed a cyber attack to Australia or our allies. But to little avail. I don't think I'd make a very good intelligence analyst, but in all seriousness, it felt like watching a chess match where only one side's pieces could be seen. This could suggest one of two things. Either Australia doesn't engage in offensive cyber strategies, or, more realistically, it does so while ensuring that these operations are proportionate, legal, and ethical so as not to arouse any diplomatic tensions. Mike Burgess, the Director General of the Australian Signals Directorate, in 2019 disclosed 3 instances where the ASD's offensive cyber capabilities directly prevented harm to Australians, and in doing so revealed the moves of a couple of Australia's pawns on the proverbial chessboard. The first example I'll present came during the height of the fight against Daesh, where the ASD supported a coalition military operation aimed at taking down the position of terrorist leaders. While the ADF, were preparing to launch an attack, the ASD operatives were at their keyboards in Australia firing bits and bytes into cyberspace, destroying communication lines within seconds. Without the ability to communicate internally, Daesh terrorists were scrambled, scattered, and disorientated. The cyber operation went hand in hand with a manned mission, resulting in decreased coalition losses and ensuring what happened went exactly to plan. In the same theatre, an unnamed ASD operative with the backing of a highly specialised team assumed the character of a terrorist leader with the aim of dissuading a radicalised young recruit from joining an Islamic terrorist group. The team included cultural experts, linguistic experts, and behavioural experts. And while the details are of course limited, what we do know is that by using social norms, broken English, and intelligence data that was gathered over years, the individual was able to be relocated to ensure that he was not a threat to Australia or our allies. The third example of a carefully targeted and legally justified event also prevented the radicalization of young individuals into transnational criminal networks. The ASD uses their offensive cyber capabilities to damage the media machines of these criminal networks, and by locking operators out of their own servers, the ASD has prevented the dissemination of harmful materials and propaganda on countless occasions. This has undermined the ability of criminal networks to convince vulnerable youth to join their organization, preempting and preventing what could have led to a catastrophic event. Now, while it's undeniable that these operations have protected Australia's national interests, our opponents reference concerns about these offensive operations being perceived as aggression. They believe that they are escalatory and belligerent. However, where they are misguided in their rebuttal is that our focus here is on dismantling criminal networks, not engaging in reckless cyber warfare against sovereign nations. We do not disagree. We disagree with your definition. Offensive cyber operations, when proportionate, legal, and ethical, do not blur the line between law enforcement and warfare, as Mike Burgess has in fact stressed. Instead, they serve as a crucial tool to neutralizing the threats that operate beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. Transnationalist terrorist networks, by their very nature, do not adhere to the unwritten laws and written laws that guide cyberspace. These entities pose a grave and unpredictable threat not just to the West, but to our allies, to our enemies, and also to our partners. The world's leading powers have consistently demonstrated unilateral support for operations that target such networks, especially when these operations serve to protect the lives and uphold the rules-based international order. We have evidence from the ASD that offensive cyber capabilities can be executed with precision and ethical responsibility. And unlike kinetic military operations, which often result in collateral damage, cyber operations have the unique capability to surgically dismantle these networks from within, with minimal harm to civilians. I'm confident that even our opponents would agree that a strategy that takes civilians out of the firing line would be a welcomed one. Now, the recently announced 2030 cyber strategy clearly states that Australia is committed to upholding international law and norms, as well as shaping a global rules-based order in line with our shared interests. And as an influential leader in the Indo-Pacific, Australia bears both a moral obligation and a responsibility to protect our partners and allies from the threats posed by cybercriminal networks. By prioritizing defensive strategies over offensive capabilities, our opponents are inadvertently suggesting that Australia should neglect these moral obligations on an international level. How can Australia position itself as a responsible regional power or effectively protect our allies from shared threats? Now, this is what cyber diplomacy really means. The affirmative team believes that the offensive capabilities do more than just disrupt potential attacks on Australia. They also safeguard our neighbours, with whom our relationships in the region are of vital interest. Our stance is clear. By prioritising offensive capabilities, Australia will have the means to preempt key threats to national security, identify and neutralise adversaries before they have the chance to strike, and dismantle their operations at the core. Prioritising defence, rather, confines us to a perpetual game of catch-up, where one day we might not get another move. Thank you.
The second speaker on the negative team is Paloma Hawkins, a final year student at the University of Sydney doing a bachelor's degree focused on international relations, political economy and the French language.
Ladies and gentlemen, the affirmative case wants us to believe that Australia must prioritise offensive measures to protect ourselves, to deter threats. But I think what they don't mention here are that these tactics themselves come with heavy threats. They do actually the opposite in deterring threats. They escalate conflict, they provoke retaliation, and ironically, they lead to a more weakened security environment than we had in the first place. I'll get to that. But I'll start by discussing the escalatory nature of offensive measures. Plus, then I'll go on to mention the attribution dilemma that makes offensive measures so incredibly reckless. I'll then dispel misconceptions that defensive strategies are passive, proving on the contrary that they're both proactive and strategic. Ultimately, I'll discuss the crucial nature of cyber diplomacy, of normative change, and global cooperation, and how it sets the path to real lasting security. Now, my first argument. Offensive measures are escalatory. They don't protect us, they provoke. They're inherently escalatory and unpredictable. When Australia engages in an over-prioritisation of offensive measures, we're inviting retaliation. We're not securing our systems. Offensive cyber attacks, let's say, is like throwing rocks in a glass house. Eventually someone's going to throw one back, and without proper defence measures and resilience, we're left picking up the pieces. I don't think this is the most productive way forward. Now, this isn't just an analogy. It's the security dilemma in action. Now, within the security dilemma, states, in trying to protect themselves, in ramping up their offensive capabilities, actually create more insecurity in others. They trigger a cycle of escalation. It becomes, some may say, a self-perpetuating arms race, where every offensive action invites a greater reaction, increasing insecurity for all. Realist Kenneth Waltz warned against this type of power maximisation, stating that, quote, in anarchy, security is the highest end. He argued that states should focus on maximising security through defensive strategies, rather than aggressive actions that really only escalate tensions and lead to further instability. Take the Stuxnet example, for example. In 2011, it was a highly targeted attack by the US and Israel on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Whilst it was hailed as a success because it did do what it set out to do, it ultimately led to Iran launching a series of retaliatory cyber attacks on US financial institutions, on their banks, between 2012 and 2013. This crippled them with denial of service attacks that left customers and businesses reeling. Stuxnet's ripple effect showed that even the most successful offensive measures, or offensive operations rather, can spiral into long-term instability for those who choose to undertake them. The same was seen in the 2017 NotPetya attack in Ukraine. What started as a malware strike on Ukraine's infrastructure quickly spread across the globe because of a release of thousands and thousands of passwords. It ended up infecting over 50 countries, including that of Australia. It didn't just hit its intended target, but it paralysed critical infrastructure, businesses, and government agencies around the world. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, while offensive actions may seem like a route to security in the short term, and let's say maybe they are, that doesn't mean that they aren't unpredictable and therefore may cause bad collateral damage. Therefore, engaging with them means stepping into a dangerous cycle of escalation and seeks to only make them a bigger threat. This leads on to my second point. The affirmative might suggest that offensive measures stop attackers. I believe the second speaker in the affirmative suggested that they deter attacks by being the first one to strike. But here's another major flaw: attribution. Attribution is an inherent dilemma in cybersecurity, and it's often nearly impossible in cyberspace. Attackers often use false flags or sophisticated methods to hide their identity, making it incredibly difficult to accurately attribute cyber attacks to specific actors, and therefore, it's a dangerous gamble. Not to mention, being a middle power, our limited resources and the inherent cost inefficiency of attribution teams. It's like being in a dark room and someone throws a punch at you. You can see who did it, you can't see who did it, so you punch back into the dark. But you might hit the wrong person. Now you've created an enemy and the original attacker is still out there. This is the inherent problem with attribution. In order to ensure that we are protected as a nation, defensive measures don't fall into this trap. They fortify our systems, focusing on protection and building resilience and minimise damage without the need for attribution and finding out exactly who it was that attacked you, because your borders are up. However, what's often misunderstood about defensive measures is that they're passive, that they're reactive, as the affirmative team has suggested. However, instead of throwing the first punch and waiting for the blowback, defensive measures offer a smarter, proactive approach without the provocation involved. Australia's cybersecurity strategy, ranging from 2023 to 2030, emphasises one thing above all: resilience. The measures focus on anticipating threats, detecting vulnerabilities, and responding quickly. Consider active threat detection. While offensive measures gamble on the risky hit before being hit approach, Australia monitors systems in real time, neutralising threats before they can cause any harm. At the strategy's core is cyber hygiene, which applies across the board from individual devices to national systems. It ensures regular updates, patches vulnerabilities, and strengthens systems. Fortifying Australia's cyber defences is crucial. I agree with what the affirmative has said, that we have had cyber attacks in our country, but that doesn't mean that we should pivot and attack those who attack us. That should signify that we need to build our defences more effectively, because otherwise the threats wouldn't be there in the first place. Offensive measures may attack, but they don't build long-lasting resilience. Without a strong defensive foundation, Australia remains exposed. Now let's look at the bigger picture. Cyberspace today can feel like the Wild West, a lawless new frontier with new rules due to a lacking legal framework. However, offensive actions only deepen this chaos. Prioritising offensive cyber measures ultimately risks undermining Australia's global standing and damaging trust with our allies. It's like playing the outlaw in a lawless land, inviting retaliation and instability. Instead, let's be the sheriff here and focus on defensive strategies with cyber diplomacy. And let's ensure long-term stability and strengthen Australia's leadership in international cooperation. The 11 norms of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace introduced by the UN in 2015 emphasise cooperation, restraint, the protection of critical infrastructure for the states themselves, and conflict prevention, steering states away from the need for offensive measures. However, these norms must be fully implemented and internalised. To be truly effective, Australia needs to be a leader in multilateral diplomacy, and it should take the charge in promoting their adoption and their internalisation. Australia's leadership in global cybersecurity, particularly through initiatives like the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, is key to advancing its goal of becoming a world leader in cybersecurity by 2030. By driving norm building, internalisation, and technical standards through alliances like ASEAN, Australia strengthens global security and ensures a safer, more stable cyberspace. Now, in sum, while offensive measures provoke retaliation, face the attribution dilemma and weaken our alliances, the attractive potential short-term benefits of these measures really lead to long-term instability. Defensive strategies focused on resilience, diplomacy, and norm building create long-lasting security. I'll leave it at this. Cybersecurity is a marathon, not a sprint, and we should treat it as such. Thank you.
The third speaker in the affirmative team is Numan Musa, a master's student at the University of New South Wales, where he's building on his dual bachelor's degrees in law and arts from the University of Sydney.
Hello everyone, my name is Numan Musa. Thank you for your patience so far, and thank you for the opposition team for your points. However, unfortunately, it seems that the opposition team has completely disregarded our examples about proportional, ethical, and legal and effective measures. You suggest that our actions would be escalatory. My question is, to whom? If you're referring to state-sponsored cybercriminal activity, this will have far more significant consequences on Australia, both legally and diplomatically. It will put the people in danger. While cyberspace is indeed a borderless realm, it is not lawless. Australian offensive cybersecurity measures are not indiscriminate attacks. They are strategic and precise to dismantle cybercriminal networks. This is fully aligned with international law. For instance, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, including Articles 14, 15, and 23, advocates for proactive measures for the states, such as expedited preservation of data and mutual assistance to combat cybercrime. These legal frameworks are proportional and provide the guidance necessary to ensure our actions are both ethical and diplomatically compliant with our allies. By adhering to international standards, Australia not only avoids a legal fallout, but also strengthens its diplomatic ties through cooperation and transparency in the fight against cyber threats. Cyber criminal organizations should never be allowed to mature. Our assertive cybersecurity measures target cyber criminals, not states. Whether these cyber criminals are non-state actors or state-sponsored, our focus is clear. We are against illegal cyber activity that threatens Australians. If a state chooses to support or endorse such actions, the responsibility lies within them, not with Australia. Offensive measures are about strengthening our digital borders, not initiating conflicts. Those state-sponsored organizations should not be engaging in the first place in any kind of activity that threatens Australian cybersecurity infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, we, the affirmative team, have shown that assertive cybersecurity policies are not about aggression, but safeguarding our nation's digital sovereignty. We are not advocating for reckless, indiscriminate retaliation. We're not going to go out there and hack the Ministry of Education in Indonesia. We are here with precise and strategic actions to dismantle cybercriminal networks that threaten the Australians' digital sovereignty. We are here with proportional, legal, and ethical conduct against these cyber criminals, not against civilians. This is not a traditional war. This is cyber warfare, which is characterized by constant evolution and adaptation, changing with each passing day. As the threat becomes more sophisticated and adaptable, so must our strategies. Prioritizing defensive measures cannot keep pace with the dynamic nature of cyber threats. To stay ahead, we must employ offensive, proactive approaches that anticipate and counter these evolving dangers. This means embracing offensive measures through intelligence gathering, cyber surveillance, and targeted actions against cybercriminal networks. Only by being both agile and proactive, we can ensure that we can protect our digital infrastructure, including our education, our health, and even your own loved ones. We have made it clear that Australia respects international law and is committed to adhere to these cybercriminal conventions. We are not here to violate international law. Our focus is simply on dismantling cybercriminal networks. We are not targeting individuals. If a state supports these networks, this fault lies upon the state, not Australia. The government must act decisively with offensive cybersecurity policies. Frameworks like the Budapest Convention endorse such measures, calling for proactive collaboration between the member states in the convention to ensure that these cyber threats don't mature in a way that threatens the sovereignty of any country. As we progress in the future, cyber threats will only increase in complexity, and simply relying on prioritizing defensive measures could threaten everything we've built in this country. The stakes are high. Last year, we had more than 300,000 cyber attacks. Do you want to take a wild guess how much we investigated? 300. Our security demands offensive, Forward-thinking cybersecurity policies that anticipate and outmaneuver these threats. Prioritizing defensive strategies leaves Australia vulnerable and always one step behind. We are not advocating for the neglect of defense. In fact, we actually want the best defense in the world. And in order to have the best defense in the world, we need the best offense in the world. We need to understand the cyber criminals we're dealing with. We need to make sure they never have anything to target us with. We wouldn't tolerate if we knew there was a terrorist organization that was planning to unleash a bombing campaign in Sydney overseas. Then why should we just tolerate cyber criminals evolving and adapting with the ever-increasing technology, especially in the age of artificial intelligence? We are simply not neglecting defense, but rather we want to prioritize offense to enhance Australia's cybersecurity in a more efficient and adaptable manner. Because proactive measures is what makes a difference between security and disaster. Thank you.
The third speaker, and our final speaker, for the negative team is Ethan Pooley. Ethan has a double bachelor's degree in political science and international studies from UTS and has spent 2 years working and studying in China.
Thank you, Ian, and good evening, everybody. It's been an engaging discussion so far. We thank the affirmative team for their considered arguments, and it's an honour to have the last say. My girlfriend's in the audience and she knows very well that I like to have the last say. So let's see how we go. So the affirmative have presented a range of arguments to kind of, they presented an offensive strategy as a way of kind of protecting Australian and Australians' interests. But at the end of the day, offensive strategy is an offensive strategy, and that will be perceived by adversaries and non-state actors alike as inherently combative, inherently escalatory, and inherently threatening to them. There is no ifs or buts about it. Offense is offense. More to this point, regarding non-state actors. If we want to seek the capability to attack all non-state actors that seek to threaten us, Australia will get ourselves in a merry-go-round, chasing our tail competition, whack-a-mole game, which we simply do not have the resources to engage in. This is exactly why we need to prioritise defensive measures so our institutions, our citizens, and our government is protected and secure from attacks before they happen. Moreover, the affirmative team tried to say that legal, ethical, and standard and norm building is important. We definitely agree, and this is a core part of our proactive defensive measures that we think is in Australia's best interest to safeguard our institutions from attacks. As a middle power, we need to know who we are. We need to know our place in the world, and we need to understand that if we seek to have an offensive strategy, that is how it will be perceived. Let's know our place. Prioritising defence is the best way to go about it, because at the end of the day, this is what we are here tonight to talk about: priorities. Australia has finite resources. We do not have the ability to, like a great power, and to go willy-nilly and spend big. We need to be responsive to the Australian people, and the Australian people want defence over offence. And to finish up our argument for tonight, it is true that we are in an increasing threat environment where it is a reality that Australian institutions and people have been the victim of cyber threats, cyber attacks, and this trend will continue into the future. It is not going away. However, We must meet the strategic threat from a position of strength, and to us, that involves prioritising our diplomatic engagement. This involves norm building, and if we were to engage in an overtly offensive strategy, as the affirmative team have proposed, this will completely undermine our credibility to engage with our regional partners. Because doing so, if we are to engage in offensive strategy, we will be left underprepared, and our defences will be left vulnerable, and our reputation and our credibility will be undermined. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Those of us who may have begun a little bit ignorant of these issues are undoubtedly much better informed by now, and are very carefully put together, I thought, very thoughtful arguments from both sides. But it's not for me to say that. We await the adjudication of our adjudicator, Tom Dixon. But while Tom's finalising his thoughts, I'll just mention that we do have another cyber-related event next week. It's not a debate, it's a discussion by two experts in the field, Stephen Che and Huon Curtis, who recently founded an infrastructure resilience firm here in Sydney. Their subject is the resilience of Australia's critical national information industries. So do come along next week and continue this rather steep learning curve that we're presiding over on cyber security. We welcome you to that. But now it's time for Tom Dixon to deliver his adjudication. Tom's the Vice President of the Institute. He's a member of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Synthetic Biology and the Manager of National Security and Defence for Macquarie University. He undertakes multidisciplinary research on the implications of synthetic biology, including technology forecasting and planning for risk management and benefit maximisation. So another expert. It's over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, everyone. That was an absolutely fantastic debate. I think everyone in the audience will agree with me that that was incredibly difficult to adjudicate for so many different reasons. But I think if we come back to the original proposition, which was that it was in Australia's best interest to prioritise offensive cyber measures over defensive cyber measures in the current threat environment. And there was going to be a need for a lot of focus on definitional work in the debate because of how much was in that proposition. And so we had things like, what is Australia's best interests? What are offensive cyber measures? What are defensive cyber measures? And what is the current threat environment? And I think both sides went to quite a lot of what was in that proposition. But what we got throughout the debate as it unfolded is a parallel kind of contest over what actually constitutes offensive cyber measures and what the current threat environment actually looks like. And on the one hand, we had a focus on offensive cyber measures such as penetration testing and cyber criminals and non-state actors. And on the other hand, we had state-to-state interactions, and examples were given on both sides. We had a fantastic story open around the Optus data breach and the individual impacts on Australians from that kind of a breach. And then we had fantastic examples about Stuxnet and the impact that has had around the world when an exploit or code gets released and is able to be used by cyber criminals. But as I sort of made my way through the debate, and I really found it very difficult to decide, I think it came down to there were a number of propositions that the affirmative put forward that went untested by the negative team, such as with the Optus example, would better defensive measures have stopped that Optus breach from happening? And I think these propositions that went untested for me are what lead me to award the debate to the affirmative. So I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the affirmative, and hopefully everyone will join me.